Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that you can be here with us tonight. Thank you for joining us from the safety of Zoom at home on this cool winter night. We welcome you to this first of our 3-week series, the speaker series this year on racism in the church. For those who may not know me, my name is James Aitchison, and on behalf of the ministry team here at Islington and on behalf of the Anti-Racism Working Group at Islington, it's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you here with us tonight, and I'll be serving as your moderator this evening. The series, as I mentioned, is being organized and hosted by the Anti-Racism Working Group here at Islington, and a very special thank you goes out to Carol Wilson, as well to Grace Quimno, who have been instrumental in organizing and hosting this series. We also thank our whole Anti-Racism Working Group for all their work, their input, and support. The first week here in our series is looking at racism in the church through the lens of politics. And that will obviously cover quite a bit of ground, but this is the opening of our series here. And as we're starting in to this series and this evening, I just want to invite you to join me for a moment in pause. Maybe you'll allow yourself to just close your eyes a moment and take a breath. And just allow yourself to land here as we begin with a land acknowledgement. Wherever you may be gathered, we can acknowledge that Islington United Church, the host of this gathering, of this series, Islington United Church is situated upon traditional territories. And we honor the Indigenous communities that have been serving as stewards and keepers of this land for thousands of years, for countless generations. We're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. And we also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Thank you for joining me in this grounding and this landing here. Helps to give ourselves a moment to pause and recognize that we are here. Now, some of you may recall that this time of year, prior to COVID at least, we at Islington had been hosting a lecture series for 3 years, and we'd been doing that through the interfaith lens. Of course, it would be great if we could be in the church together this evening, but we're grateful that we're able to connect through Zoom. And of course, that enables us to reach a lot of folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to be here tonight. I do want to let you know that our evening, at least the front portion of the evening with our guest speaker, that's going to be recorded. And later we're going to be able to host that on our church website. So if you want to look at the video again and follow up on something, or if you'd like to share that, you can do so. I'll just name now a little bit about the evening and the lay of the land, how the evening will run. And obviously now we're beginning with opening remarks and a little bit of a welcome and introduction. In a moment, I'll introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Brian Carwana. And then in a few minutes, probably 3 or so minutes, we'll hand it over to him, and he will speak for about an hour and sharing all that he's brought with us to share tonight. We're going to take a short break after that. So I just want to invite you that while Dr. Carwana is sharing, if there's anything really piquing your curiosity that you'd like to follow up on, maybe jot down a question, because during the break, you can share your questions with me through the chat feature here on Zoom. And we'll just take maybe a 3-minute break, something like that, if you want to just stretch your legs, grab a cup of tea or something. But as I said, you can share your questions through the chat feature, and I'll be gathering some of those questions. And then for about half an hour after the break, we'll have a bit more of an informal conversation through Q&A with Dr. Carwana. So again, feel welcome to jot down your questions throughout the lecture portion, and we can follow up with some of those. And following the Q&A, which will be about half an hour, we'll just have some closing remarks, and that will be our evening. So we hope to run just about 2 hours here. And again, grateful that you can be here. We're also very grateful that our guest speaker this evening is joining us, Dr. Brian Carwana, also known as the ReligionsGeek. He left a business career to pursue a passion for studying religions. He completed a master's in religion and culture, as well as a PhD from the University of Toronto, where he studied religion and politics. For the last 20 years, Dr. Carwana has served as the executive director of Encounter World Religions. And this is a non-sectarian consulting organization which helps people, organizations, and communities explore what it means to become religiously literate and to enhance their understanding of each other and the world. Religion remains for Dr. Carwana one of the most interesting facets of life to help understand global politics, social movements, workplace cohesion, as well as our individual lives. So I invite you, all those of us gathered here, to join me as we welcome Dr. Carwana into the space. Picture a hall with applause.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate your time. It's so thrilling, really, to see so many of you on this. So, let me share my screen here. Here we go. I presume that is working, and if it's not, somebody throw a brick at me or something. Yeah, so tonight, to talk to you about racism and religion in Canada. When I started to tackle this, I thought this is a big topic. Like, you could teach several university courses. What angle do I take? So I had to make choices. The series is Racism in the Church. And in some later sessions, you have folks who are more expert on the church. My thing is world religions. And so I hope that you'll be happy with the decision I made, which was to look at the broader question of racism and religion. And I'm looking at racism, not, of course, just in terms of anti-Black, but First Nations, Jews, Muslims, and other minorities. And so that's the angle I took. And I hope basically at the end, I hope that you'll feel that you got something out of this, that you learned something. Okay, so with that, all right, here's kind of our agenda. I wanted to do 4 things. First, I want to discuss stereotyping and what I consider to be religion's unique role here. That is, obviously we stereotype without religion, but I do think religion adds something, oddly, that matters. Second, sorry, I'm just having a little problem with I think I can fix this. There we go. Second, I want to talk about Christian doctrines and their impact in Canada. There's nothing unique about Christian stereotyping. Every religious group has a history of doing this at one time or another. But of course, in Canada, the dominant group has been Christianity. And so the dominant group is always the ones in the position usually to do stereotyping. And so I want to talk about their impact. Third, I want to review some of the racist practices in Canadian history, which is obviously, that can't possibly be comprehensive, but I want to give a sense of some things. And last, I want to end with something more positive, which is, what can we do about it? What can we do about creating a more inclusive society of people across their differences, race, religion, because all these things, of course, intersect, sexuality. And so I want to end on some things we can do. Okay, and so let's start here. Let's discuss stereotyping, religion's unique contribution or role. I read a fair bit about this, and there are a lot of people in the biological sciences and neuroscience, as well as in social psychology, who will simply tell you that the reality is that stereotyping is unfortunately somewhat natural to humans. It's why we have implicit biases. And the problem is that our brains get overwhelmed. There's so much information, there's so many faces, they have facial expressions, they're looking at places, they're speaking. And our brain needs shortcuts. And these shortcuts, some research shows that we are especially likely to use them in what are called blank slate situations. That is, if you know the person well, your brain doesn't need to fill in gaps because you have content about them, right? But when you don't know the person, or if you might know the person personally, or they might be a famous person, right? Barack Obama. But when you don't know the person, then the brain rushes to fill it. You know how people say, I can't be racist, my best friend is Black, or my wife is Black. But the point is, your brain has so much information on them, you won't stereotype. But when you come to someone you don't know as well, when it's a customer walking in and you've never met them before, that is where the brain will tend to do these things even below the level of our consciousness, because we don't like the vacuum. And the most urgent task that the mind runs to is to sort into us or them. Is this part of us or is this someone else? And there is essentially a kind of natural tribalism in that once we've decided whether they are the us or others, our brains have an unconscious bias for those who are us. We will tend to favor us. We will look upon us more benevolently. We will cheer us, the successes of people who are part of the we. At this point, however, it is not necessarily hostile to others. That sort of depends. The bias for us is always there, but hostility for others is not necessarily or always there. It just depends. Us and them can become us versus them. And at that point, when that happens, some science shows, some studies in cognitive science show that we will start taking pleasure not only at our group's success, but we will take pleasure at their failures and their humiliations. And you can see this in sports. You can see it in American politics, right? Where I think each of those two parties not only wants to win, they want to see their opponent destroyed. They want to see them humiliated. And I don't say that to attack our neighbors to the south. It's just the nature of it. We are all sort of capable of this. But this happens, you don't need religion for this. This will happen in all sorts of situations. How does religion intersect with this? What is the role of religion? And I put the word contribution in quotes. That is, religion does do something with respect to stereotyping. It does a couple of things. The first is it has the capacity to make the distinctions sacred. That is, to take these stereotypes or these differences of us and them and imbue them with a kind of sacred meaning or import, to give them that added weight. The fancy term for this in academia is to make the differences what are called ontological. And ontological means it's in the order of things. It's in the very nature of being. We versus them is not some decision we made. It's ordained this way. Sometimes the division is made by heaven itself, right? So an example, for example, drawing from religion is the caste system in India. These folks are Dalits or untouchables. And the idea in India is that this isn't just this group is oppressing or has power over this group. It's that their status is by the nature of their birth, which is determined by karma. And karma is the law of the universe. So it's not about, maybe we should change our groups. It's the very order of the universe itself, right? And that is what religion can do. It can give it an ontological existence. It's from the very nature of being itself. To give another example, in Buddhism, the Buddha ordained nuns, which at that time in India, to ordain women as well as men, to take them into monastic orders, was a definite elevation of women's status in India at the time. However, there are rules that it is said that he came up with. There's an argument in Buddhism whether they were his or whether they were designed later, that have the nuns subservient to men. So one of the sayings is that even a nun who's been ordained for 100 years must kind of bow and do homage to a monk who was ordained yesterday. Right now, you and I might say, oh, that's not a good rule. But if it does come from the Buddha, or if some in the tradition understand it's from the Buddha, and the Buddha was enlightened and knew the truth about the universe, then it has a sacred existence that is hard to challenge, right? And so religion can do this. And the second thing that religion can do, besides make distinctions sacred, is that religion, I'm reading this great book by an atheist psychologist, actually, who is tabulating all of the scientific evidence around how religion works so well. It's a great book. I'll definitely be writing on it soon. And in the field, they talk about spiritual technologies. That is, there are things that religion does that naturally create strong bonds. Something as simple as ritual. If you have 40 people in a room and they are moving at the same time and doing the same thing, and you simply wire them up, you will find that their heart rates become in concert, their breathing becomes in concert. And if you then test them, they will be kinder to each other than to someone else, even if they were strangers at the beginning. And it doesn't matter what the action is. You can be pushing keys on a pad, but if you're all doing the same thing rather than different things, syncopated movements connect us to people. I give this as a very simple example. There are many examples of where religion is very good at bonding us to one another. What is one of the things religion does great? Community, right? That's what it is. It's bonding. And in bonding, which is a wonderful thing, but often in life, sometimes wonderful things have shadow sides. And the shadow side of tight community is the potential of creating a very strong us, which can sometimes lead to hostilities towards them. Okay, so that is stereotyping, and where religion has a unique role, which is it can sacralize divisions, and it has spiritual technologies that can create particularly strong bonds. Second, let's talk then about Christian doctrines and their impact in Canada and Canadian history. Christianity does have what I would call certain resources for discrimination or racism. There is a scholar who said that cultures are like toolkits. She's a very famous scholar. And I've actually said that this is true of religions, that religions are like toolkits. And you know, if you have a hammer, you can use a hammer to build and you can use a hammer to destroy. And at different times, you pick up different tools. And if you think of religions this way, it's how they function. You can watch over the centuries how certain tools get picked up and used for a while, and then they get put down because the culture changes. Or sometimes it's picked up, but now it's used in a different way. And so Christianity is a kind of toolkit. And later I will be talking about how some of these tools can be put to good use. But if we are talking about racism, we need here to talk about how some of them have been put to bad use, and so some tools have not been helpful. And so one of them, and I want to highlight 4 within Christianity that have stood out to me. One is called the curse of Ham. This is a biblical story where Noah is naked and his son Ham sees him naked. And Noah, it's not really clear how this makes sense in the text. Noah curses him. Now, more particularly, he actually curses Ham's son, whose name is Canaan, because Ham saw Noah naked. At the time that this is written, more than probably around 2,500 years ago or so, the writer is likely cursing the Canaanites, right? Canaanites, who were rivals to the Israelites. And that tool, that little passage of scripture just sat there, right? But much, much later, just in more recent centuries, Christians in particular, going through these texts, took up this tool and reinterpreted it. And they said the curse actually is that Ham's son Canaan was given dark skin. And so the curse, the mark, is dark skin. And they use this, of course, to say that blacks were inferior, that they were cursed by God, right? It reinforces the us and the them, and it sacralizes because it's in the text. And this is one of the things that has plagued North American society, including in Canada. A second resource that has been harmful is the notion of the jealous God. Sometimes people think Judaism was like really novel in having monotheism. And this is not quite true. There were other monotheists in the Greco-Roman milieu. What was unique was exclusive monotheism. That is, that there is one God, there's only one God, and to because otherwise monotheism sometimes can be, well, we call God this, but they call him that, or they think there's 3, but actually there's 1. But what was unique in Judaism was if you got this wrong, it was a kind of moral failing. And it's not in some marginal text, it's right in the 10 Commandments. It says in the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me. And it's multiple times in the text. In another place in the text, it says, for the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. And these are in the Jewish text, and therefore, of course, also in the Christian Bible. And this notion of a jealous God means other religious systems are not merely cognitive errors. Right? I understand God this way and you understand God that way. I might think you're mistaken, but your heart's in the right place. This notion, if it's used in a particular way, makes your cognitive error a grave offense, a grave moral failing, right? And naturally sort of breeds a kind of intolerance. And so in early Christian centuries, when they converted pagans, the convert had to confess that all the pagan deities that they had been worshiping were actually demons. That was unique, right? That was a change, was this jealous God, which does sort of make other forms of religiosity grave offenses and grave sins. And so that's the second thing, the jealous God. The third, and this ties into this, is the notion of Satan. Satan, the devil, is, many people don't know this, is virtually absent from the Hebrew Bible. He shows up most notably in the book of Job, but in the book of Job, he's not the devil. Satan in Hebrew is a general noun, not a proper noun. It's not a name. It means the advocate or the adversary. It's used many times in the Hebrew Bible to say he was an adversary or something like that. In the book of Job, Satan, the advocate, the adversary, we even today say devil's advocate, is in the divine court with God, right? He's having conversations. He's not yet the devil. However, a different understanding of Satan emerges in the last few centuries BCE. If you're used to the term BC, BCE means before the Common Era, but it's the same dates. So kind of 200, 300, 250 BCE, we start getting this idea of Satan, not as a generic noun and not someone in the heavenly court, but as the devil that you're familiar with. And by that point, most of the Hebrew Bible is kind of closed and written. And so, as I say, he doesn't really show up in the Hebrew Bible. But the Christian Gospels, the Christian texts will all emerge after this. And he takes a very prominent role in the Gospels and the New Testament, right? He's very prominent, for example, in the Gospel of Mark. And what does this do? It really heightens the idea of spiritual warfare, right? That the earth is a kind of battleground. And we're going to see how this gets played out as well. And fourth and last, and I do apologize about this. I know many of you are Christians. I hope that this doesn't seem like I'm piling on. I just want to highlight how these have been used so we can see how it's been played out. And fourth and last is anti-Semitism. And one of the things that it always pains me to say, because I know for many Christians, one of the things they cherish the most is the Gospels. And there's good reason, right? The Gospels have beauty in them and sometimes pure gold. But it is true that the Gospels, on the flip side, do in many ways somewhat invent anti-Semitism. I don't mean to say that there wasn't anti-Jewish thought before, because prejudice, as we mentioned, is a kind of biological reality of humans, and so that was there. But what gets invented in the Gospels is the sacralization of Jews as a kind of special villain that will carry on for 2,000 years, that will make anti-Semitism what is called today sometimes the longest hatred. And what happens is that in the Gospel, there are passages, several passages, including one of the most famous one is the blood curse. And the blood curse is Jesus is being tried by Pilate. And in the Gospels, Pilate supposedly does not want to kill Jesus. Pilate comes off as very innocent. I will tell you, there are no scholars that think Pilate was innocent. Pilate, even amongst Roman leaders, contemporaries considered him particularly bloodthirsty. But in the Gospels, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, they don't want Pilate to really be the one killing Jesus. They want the Jews to be killing Jesus. And so Pilate doesn't want to kill him. And what happens is the Jewish crowd calls out, supposedly in unison, to have Jesus killed. And they say, his blood be upon us and on our children. And folks, I would suggest to you, and I've not read this anywhere, this is my own 2 cents, you can take it with a bit of salt, but I would suggest to you that no crowd in human history has said this. If you think that someone is being tried and serving a sentence for what they did, you don't say his blood is or her blood is on my head, it's on their head. They're getting what they deserved, right? But if I think they're innocent and you're doing it, I will say their blood's on your head. And that's what Matthew's doing here, because he thinks Jesus is innocent, but then Matthew puts it in their own mouth. They call the curse upon themselves and horribly on our children. And so 1500 years later, Christians will still be saying, you called the curse down upon him, upon yourselves, your ancestors did, and you're the children. The curse is on you. And the other gospel where it really sticks out, it's usually considered the worst for this issue, is the Gospel of John. Because in the other gospels, and I know John is poetic and beautiful in many places, but in the other gospels where Jesus's enemies are the Sadducees or the Pharisees or this person or that person, in John's gospel, a full 30 times, his enemies are identified simply as the Jews. And it's a terrible framing because everyone is a Jew. I mean, occasionally there's a Roman, but Jesus is a Jew. His disciples are Jews. His followers are Jews. His enemies are Jews. People who are on the side and don't care are Jews. Everyone in the scene is a Jew. But John repeatedly refers to his enemies simply as the Jews, pulling his enemies into finding the whole people by it. And it's just really, it's really unfortunate. And the reason that this happened is for two reasons. One is that Jesus was killed as a Roman criminal, and early Christians were in trouble. They were being persecuted by the Romans, and it wasn't good to be following a guy who was killed basically for sedition. Jesus was killed for sedition. That's why they put the King of the Jews on the cross, and he's killed as a Roman criminal. And so it was much better for early Christians to say, look, Pilate didn't really want to kill him. It was the Jews who forced his hand, right? They were under threat of death. And when you're under threat of death, who knows what we might do. And the second thing is there was a really horrific split in the community as Christians, the Jesus followers pulled away from their fellow Jews. And lots of negative things were said on both sides. I'm sure many Jews said horrible things about Christians. We see Paul killing Christians. The difference is the Jews weren't writing scriptures at this time, and the Christians were. And so the negative things that Jews said got said, but the negative things that some Christians said got written. They got written. They got put in those texts that in many places are beautiful, but this is kind of the birth of anti-Semitism, is that it sacralizes the Jews as a special enemy, as a blood curse, who called upon, who said the death of Jesus is on us and all of our children. Okay, and so these are the unfortunate tools: the curse of Ham, the jealous God, the idea of Satan that demonizes opponents, and anti-Semitism. And all of this stuff that I went back and talked to you about, was written down thousands of years ago. And yet, as we're going to see, it's relevant today. And all of them also will fit into something else that happens as the Europeans come to Canada or come to the Americas. And that is the notion of the progress narrative. Christianity triumphed eventually in Europe over several centuries. And then what happened is 1,000 years later, Europe became a military and technological superpower through the Enlightenment and through things like the Industrial Revolution, the development of capitalism. And so they had the best weapons, and they had these fancy ocean-going ships that perhaps only the Chinese could match at the time. And unfortunately, when you read human history, so many times, many human societies, by no means are the Europeans unique on this front, have attributed military victory to the superiority of their gods or their religion. And so the Europeans do this. They moralize their technological and military superiority. We have better guns, we have better ships, right? But this indicates superior values, superior morals, superior religions. Better guns, better ships. This is because we have the true faith. Our technological superiority is due to our faith in Jesus, and they moralize what is, capitalism and some technology. And with this, as they will encounter other peoples, Canada will not only be affected by this progress narrative, but I would say even to this very day, we still suffer under what I call the bias for monotheism. We inherited in this country this tendency to equate monotheism with being smart or sophisticated. Now, today, in the last few decades, I would say sometimes being smart or sophisticated is dismissing religion. That's a secondary bias, another bias, not secondary as in less, but a newer one. But there is a bias that is older, and that is the bias to see polytheism or animism as primitive. right? You saw this in the way that Europeans addressed First Nations people, the way that Europeans acted when they went to India, when they went to Africa, when they encountered indigenous peoples in South America. And we picked it up. We picked it up in the way that people, no one sat you down and said this, but you would pick it up in a million little ways. You picked it up on Saturday morning cartoons, right? Where the indigenous person is barefoot and they got a spear and they're angry and they want to cook you and all this sort of stuff, right? And I would swear to you, it is still there today. I live, eat, and breathe religions. I teach religions all the time. I speak to people who are over 90 in my programs, and I speak to high school kids all the time. I've been asked a million questions about religion. To this day, for 20 years, there is a very basic question, because people ask me about the religions, but they ask personal questions as well. There is still a question no one to this day has ever asked me. No one has ever said to me, Brian, do you believe in the gods? I've been asked if I believe in God a quadrillion times, but do I believe in the gods? No one's ever asked me that, right? And some of that maybe is because I'm white, but some of it, I think, is because, you know, I'm supposed to be the expert. I went to university, right? I got PhD, and we don't equate polytheism with sophistication. I would submit to you that this bias is still there. Okay, so that is some of the Christian doctrines around those four things: the curse of Ham, Satan, I just missed one, the jealous God, and anti-Semitism, but also the progress narrative and the monotheistic bias. And so, having talked about those doctrines, I want to review some of the things that have happened in Canadian history. That progress narrative, of course, deeply impacted the engagement with First Nations. It led to framing First Nations peoples as being backward, sometimes as savages or barbarians, and sometimes as children who someone had to come and teach them, like, you know, in such a paternalistic way. Based on our modern values, we would probably say today that those First Nations communities were honestly more advanced on things like gender relations. Europeans could not understand how women were given such a role in First Nations community. On sexual ethics, that they were more liberal on sexual ethics. On disciplining children, this is another thing, is missionaries felt that First Nations people simply didn't keep their children under control. They were used to strict discipline. You know, you hit children, and the First Nations communities did not do this. And also on hierarchical versus egalitarian politics. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's significant, substantial arguments that part of what fostered democracy in the United States were the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois peoples. The folks in the United States, you know, they left dictatorships, and they came to the States, honestly, to create theocracies, right? Like the Puritans, but they end up with democracy. Where did that come from? And a lot of people say that what it came from, because you can look at the writings of people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and people they read like John Locke. And so many of them make reference to the indigenous peoples, because they had a kind of early form, a sort of democratic egalitarian society. And the American peoples, the Europeans, were living next to that society for centuries. They were interacting with them. I think it's Franklin who says, you know, you have this phenomenon of people who, like, somehow maybe they get abducted by indigenous peoples, or maybe they're trading with them, and then they don't come back. They like that society, and they, you know, quote unquote, go native, and they go and join them, and they don't come back. And he says, we never see the reverse. The reverse never happens, right? Because there wasn't egalitarian politics there. But because these folks are so wedded to who has a gun and who has a boat, you know, they couldn't see this. And of course, First Nations people were deeply knowledgeable about the land. They literally kept the early Europeans alive because they didn't know what they were doing. And they did things like that Europeans didn't realize, like forest management. We know now that they did things like try to replace non-productive trees with nuts and things like this to make the forest more productive. But this, of course, shaped the early dealings in Canada with Indigenous peoples. It continued to the very founding of our country with John A. Macdonald MacDonald is particularly known for his policy of starvation. There was a famine that hit the prairie nations due to the decimation of the bison herds in the USA. The famine was not caused by MacDonald. It was caused by in the 1880s, the Americans with the railroads just basically wiped out the bison herds. We have pictures like this. These are not bison bones. These are just the skulls. These are just bison skulls, just millions of bisons wiped out. I can only imagine how different our continent would look today if this hadn't happened. And so what happened immediately was the bison, of course, didn't know borders, right? They crossed the borders. And so they were shot in the States, but the prairies community suddenly were starving to death because their main source of food was gone. And what MacDonald did was to ensure that the government kept them on the brink of starvation all the time, partly so that he could coerce them, coerce the removal to reserves so that he would have land to build the railroad. Even on the reserves, the food provided was insufficient, sometimes rancid. The providers provided, they just reneged on, they got government money and then they provided rotten food. They didn't care. And so people died. From 1880 to 1885, in just 5 years, it's estimated that more than a third of the Indigenous peoples on Canada's prairies died, largely due to starvation and illness stemming from malnutrition. And it was a few decades, basically, of constant famine. And you know what the opposition parties did at first? They accused him in Canada's parliament of being too soft on the Indigenous peoples. Later, after Louis Riel, it became a story started finally coming to the Eastern press about how bad it was in the prairies. And then his opponents accused him of cruelty. But it was there was not much opposition to this policy for a long time. And the thing that gets me is it's easy for us to think MacDonald's a monster. And I honestly don't think he was. This was not a Hitler. I've read stuff about how on some things he was a little bit advanced. He thought that his predecessors had treated the Indigenous peoples too cruelly, which is weird when you read what he did. And he was one of the early voices in Canada that said that they should get the vote. It's so shocking, right? None of this means that what he did was monstrous. I bring this up because with someone like Hitler, it's easy to say, well, that guy's just a monster. But the truth is, MacDonald was respected in society, and there's respected people in society mostly backed what he was doing. And had we lived in those days, had we been the same race as him, there is a good chance that many of us would have acted similarly. And that is a hard pill to swallow, but I think history teaches us that this is true. MacDonald did other things. He banned the potlatch, he banned the powwow, and of course, it is under him that we get the expansion and the administration of the residential schools. And MacDonald spoke in the House of Commons where he said, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. He is simply a savage who can read and write. And so, of course, they abducted children, essentially, forcibly removed them and stuck them into those schools. And there were people teaching them who would tell them that the ways of your parents were the ways of the devil, right? Demonic ideas, that very idea of Satan and of the jealous God. And they would hit them and beat them, and of course, abuse them in other ways. As we get into the 20th century, the main architect of this, one of the most famous people for it, is Duncan Campbell Scott. And Scott, again, I would submit to you, I don't think if you knew Scott at the time, if he was your neighbor, you would think this guy's a horrible human being. He was a poet. He was a well-published poet. He wrote pretty good poetry. And yet he was a superintendent at the Department of Indian Affairs and was rewarded for his role. And he famously said, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not an Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. And Campbell Scott does not see this as him being vicious. He sees his role as bringing up the children, right? Making them modern, taking them away from their savagery and their barbarism. And it is horrible to read all this. And this, of course, is the very basis of cultural genocide, right? The banning of the potlatch, the banning of the powwow, taking them out of their schools. Canada has a physical genocide in the erasure of human life with respect to First Nations, but here we have a government policy of cultural genocide that's supported across the political spectrum. Racism in Canada is not just against First Nations, however. It is also against a number of other groups like Sikhs. From 1904 to 1908, there were 5,000 immigrants from India settled in Canada, most of them from the Punjab, most, not all, but most of them Sikh. And this then led to a backlash. And in order to stem this migration, the Canadian government passed the Continuous Journey Regulation. And what it said is that in order to come into Canada, your boat, the boat from your country of origin could not stop anywhere before it got to Canada. The reason they did this is there were no boats from India that came straight to Canada. They always stopped and so to prevent the Indians from coming in. Canada had a problem in that it had to hide its racism because the Brits were in charge of India and they didn't want backlash in India. So Canada wanted to be racist while pretending that actually the regulation is neutral. And so this is their way around it. It's just a continuous journey regulation that, oh, by the way, happens to apply to you people from India. William Lyon Mackenzie King, the future prime minister, was at the time the minister of immigration. And of course, he said, this is in the interest of the Indians themselves because they're from a tropical climate. They won't adjust here. What a nice guy he was being. And Sikhs in Canada all know this story, that there was an attempt to break this using this boat, the Kamagata Maru. All Sikhs pretty much in Canada know this story. And what it was is that a businessman, a guy named Gurjit Singh, persuaded about 400 people from the Punjab. Many of them were dependents of immigrants who had been let in before the regulation into Canada to buy passage on the ship to come to Canada. And they showed up in Vancouver Harbor. And there, the officials did not let them disembark. And the ship sat there in harbor for 2 months while they tried to negotiate disembarking. The Vancouver papers were filled with racist epithets to keep them away. And eventually, I think something like 20 people were somehow allowed to disembark because of special circumstances, but the rest were forced to leave. The ship was escorted out of harbor at gunpoint. Had to go all the way back to India, and when it did, it faced violence by the British government in India when they returned. And this is one of the earliest stories of Sikhs in Canada. Racism in Canada was also perpetuated against the Chinese. In the 19th century, businessmen actively recruited the Chinese to come to Canada because they wanted them to build the railroad. Chinese immigrants were seen as cheap labor and honestly as disposable labor. They were usually given the most dangerous jobs on the railroad, in mining, lumber, and manufacturing. They were offered half the wages and they died. Many of them died. They died from explosives. They died from manufacturing accidents. They died from malnutrition, and they died from illness. And then once the railroad was finished, they no longer needed them. And so at that point, what the government did was to impose a head tax on Chinese immigrants. It was first $50, then it was raised a few years later to $100, then to $500, and then eventually they just banned Chinese immigration altogether. And so what happened is that from 1878 to 1923, there were about 80,000 immigrants that came from China. And then in the next 25 years, there were only seven made it in. The railroad, 2/3 of the laborers on the railroad were Chinese. But if you ever see this image of the last spike, here he comes, the government official to drive the last spike, there's not a Chinese person in the crowd. They, of course, made sure that none of them were visible, right? And this is the progress narrative about China. And this is their heathens, right? Christian churches, Christian language, Christian ministers played a part in this demonization of the other. They're heathens. They don't know Jesus. And of course, Jews. And this figure, this guy is to me a bit more villainous, straight up. Frederick Blair, who was a proud and virulent anti-Semite and saw his job as keeping out Jews. The most famous incident was in 1939 when a boat came, the St. Louis, with 908 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, and Blair made sure that they were refused. They eventually ended up landing in Holland. Holland was then conquered by the Nazis, and it's estimated that about 250 of them died in the Holocaust. Even after the war and after Blair, Canada took in only about 8,000 Holocaust survivors, which some authors said is arguably the worst record amongst all the refugee receiving states. And even 10 years after the war, in 1950s Canada, there was just so much anti-Semitism. Rabbi Abraham Feinberg was probably Canada's most prominent rabbi in Canada in the 1950s. And in 1954, he wrote an article that was published in Maclean's. The article is called, "Those Jews, we fight Hitler's creed overseas, but we have a seedling of it right here at home," says this rabbi. And the rabbi was Rabbi Feinberg. And in the article, he writes what it is to be a Jew in Canada in the 1950s. He says, Jews are kept out of most ski clubs. Sundry summer colonies, fraternities, and at least one Rotary Club operate under written or unwritten Gentiles-only signs. Many bank positions are not open to Jews. Only 3 Jewish male physicians have been admitted to non-Jewish hospital staffs in Toronto. He goes on, McGill University has instituted a rule requiring in effect at least a 10% higher academic average for Jewish applicants. City councils debate whether Jewish petitioners should be permitted to build a synagogue. Property deeds in some areas bar resale to them. And I have seen crude handbills circulated thanking Hitler for his massacre of 80,000 Jews in Kiev. And of course, racism in Canada has also been anti-Black, first and foremost through slavery. Slavery existed in Canada for 2 centuries before it was abolished in 1834. After that, there was 30 years of the Underground Railroad, which did give escape to around 30,000 American Blacks. But generally what happens in our schools is almost all Canadians know about the Underground Railroad and its 30 years, but not many know about the 200 years of slavery. I've read some Black scholars in Canada who said it's amazing how 30 years can erase 200. And of course, even with the Underground Railroad and the end of slavery, there was ongoing discrimination of all sorts. Did you know that Canada had segregated public schools? They were practically celebrated and segregated in many places, but they were legally segregated in Ontario and in Nova Scotia from 1850. And the last one in Ontario didn't actually close until 1963, right? This is Martin Luther King's time, essentially. So there were segregated schools in many municipalities. Blacks were banned from medical schools at Queen's and McGill's until the 1960s, again, the time of Martin Luther King. And the University of Toronto actually banned all Black students in the 1920s. They were also banned from many hair salons, barber shops, from inns and motels, from many restaurants, and even public places, things like skating rinks and public swimming pools, because whites wouldn't go in the pool if a Black person was in it, right? And this is a big part of our history. And of course, it's not just our history, right? It is also our present. The climate for bias in Canada, we are on the one hand today, surely doing more to think about racism and think about inclusion, probably than at any other time, certainly that I remember in my life. But while we are aware of that, many of us are not aware how strong the backlash is. And one way to see this is to track hate crimes in Canada. And this is what hate crimes look like in the past decade in Canada. You can notice from about 209 to 216, it is flat. And then in 217, if you look at 2017, that number compared to the prior year jumps by almost 50%. This is the first year of the Trump presidency, which seemed to give such cover to these sorts of sentiments. And in Canada, that jump was driven specifically by an almost doubling, an 83% increase, specifically in religious hate crimes. It is the year of the Quebec City mosque shooting, amongst other things. That's not enough numerically to account for that, obviously, but that was the most egregious example. And you can see since then, it was high in 2018, 2019, it did not go back down. And then in 2020, a new record. The 2020 number, if you look first that earlier decade, it is, almost twice as high. And the early numbers from 2021 are that it is going to break the 2020 record. We are in the midst of a surge of hate crime. We've seen this in the States with the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, but in Canada, although we've not had a massacre of Jews, Jews are the #1 target of religious groups for hate crimes in Canada. In Halifax, I remember there were these stickers put around that said, COVID, the bug that backfired. There's a conspiracy about COVID. As soon as there's a conspiracy, you can literally just start counting somewhere if you want. Someone is going to blame the Jews. It's just like a law. It will happen. There is violence against synagogues all the time. This was last year. This was Leonard Cohen's synagogue in Montreal. A guy put swastikas all over it and they arrested him. He had a gas can and lighting fluid. He was going to burn down the whole synagogue. There has just been a storm of anti-Semitic acts in Canada and in really across the entire Western world in the last 5 to 10 years. I've been just shocked. This is Irwin Cutler. Irwin Cutler is probably Canada's most famous lawyer, human rights lawyer. He was Nelson Mandela's lawyer. He's been a human rights lawyer his whole life. He's a saint, if there is such a thing. This guy is a saint. And Cutler is Jewish. He's old. He's in his 70s, I think, possibly closing in on 80. And he said recently, there is a pandemic of hate, that never in his life has he seen so much hatred directed at his community, as well as some others, a pandemic of hate, drawing on the language that we are all so familiar with. Hate crimes against Jews are at a high in Canada versus any recent decade. The second most targeted religious group in Canada are Muslims. And the three acts of outright murder against a religious minority in the last 5 years in Canada have all been against Muslims. There were the 6 killed in Quebec City 4 years ago. Then just over a year ago, there was a man in Toronto killed at a mosque. He was a caretaker. He was outside the mosque with the hand sanitizer, and someone just went up and killed this man. I think he was in his 50s. And then, of course, there was the event in London in the summer. All 3 of these events. And while these grab our attention, nationwide, many Muslims are aware of a lot of other things. Just to give you an example, this is a story from the Calgary Herald from last March of a woman being attacked in the park and beaten and people taking off her hijab. This is one story, but there were 7 Muslim women in Alberta who were attacked like this in just the first quarter of last year, 7 different incidents. Right? If you're in that community and you go to mosque, you'll hear of these stories. Guess what happened again, this time in Edmonton? Guess what happened again, this time down the road in Red Deer, right? It creates a climate of fear. And the rest of us don't hear about these stories mostly. But if you're in these communities, you're aware of it. Okay? So that's just some of the racist practices and experiences in Canadian history, and the continued history in some cases was yesterday. Lastly, I want to talk about what can we do. Well, first, of course, is to be aware of our own biases, of our tendencies towards biases, to be aware of our tendencies towards racial biases, to be aware of that blank slate. And there are others who can speak on this, and have spoken at much more depth than I can. And I wanted to talk about something specific around religion. I do want to encourage you to be aware of the monotheism bias, right? That we have this in our society, that you will, if you start looking for it, you will see it in subtle ways about, when we talk about religion, we immediately talk about God, singular, right? It's a monotheism bias. And I also wanted to suggest to you to be aware of something else. And this is what I call the Western lens. What is the Western lens? Because it affects the way that religious groups are excluded in Canada. It has to do with our word religion. If I were to say to you, what is religion? I'm sure all of you would say, well, I kind of know what religion is. Fair enough. But in the universities, there's a lot of struggle to define this word. And part of it is that the word religion is only a European word. It's in Spanish, it's in Portuguese, it's in Swedish and Austrian and in Czech. Historically, you would not find this word in Mandarin. You wouldn't find it in the languages of India. You wouldn't find it in Japanese. You wouldn't find it in First Nations language. They did not have this word. Sometimes the word has been developed in more recent centuries in engaging with the West, but traditionally the word is just a European word. Why does this matter? Because the word evolved in Europe. it inherited certain European ways of thinking that distort our ability to see other religions clearly. I want to give you a little history lesson on this. So only take 5 minutes because it's when we're not going to be talking about the past, really. We're talking about you and I today and the society we live in, and I'll tie it to modern events. The origin, the modern understanding of this word owes something to Martin Luther, who started the Protestant Reformation. Luther existed at a time when the Catholic Church was, one of the most powerful institutions in the world and certainly in Europe. It owned vast tracts of land and it controlled your salvation. Kings quaked in front of it. And with that power came a certain amount of corruption. Many Catholics today would acknowledge that this was a bad time for the church. And honestly, many Catholics at the time said, hey, we're losing our way. We need to clean up this shop. And Luther was one of them. He was a very devout Catholic monk. But Luther was particularly headstrong. The Pope was headstrong. And so you get the split. And in human society, sometimes when a pendulum swings too far one way, there's corruption and abuse. Often we don't respond by bringing the pendulum to center. We respond by swinging it hard the other way. And that's sort of what happens here. And so Luther is upset at the Pope and at the priests that they're making doctrines that he says are not justified by the tradition, are not justified by the Gospels and things like this. But Luther doesn't just say this Pope is wrong or that priest is wrong. He says the very idea that authority comes from a priesthood is wrong. Authority should not come from clerics. True authority must come from something else. And where must it come from? He says it must come from a book, from the Bible. Books over priests. And most of us are like this. When I teach other religions and people want to know what they say, what the imam says is fine, but what they really want to know is, what does the Quran say? What do their texts say? What do their scriptures say? We think scriptures are like the last word. Books over priests. That's one. Two, the other thing about the church's power was it controlled particular rituals, sacraments, and these sacraments could save you. And if you weren't, if you didn't have these, if these sacraments were inaccessible to you, if you'd been excommunicated, you were doomed. You had to have these sacraments. You had to have masses said for your dead mother, or she was going to suffer for forever. And Luther, again, does not merely complain about the abuse of the sacraments. Luther says the whole idea that practices or rituals will save you is wrong. What it's going to save you is not what you do, a practice. What it's going to save you is belief. Beliefs over practices. Beliefs and books. And we all tend to think this way, right? Whenever I teach about religions, usually what people want to know first is, what do they believe? What do their books say? Eventually we get to practices, but we think beliefs are the core of religion. This is a very particular European sort of historical understanding. Third, there was another thing the Catholic Church had, and that is that they had these objects. They had statues that cried. I used to have this in my office. This was a relic of the true cross. In the very center of this image, inside the red cross, there are two little brown slivers like this. They are slivers of wood said to be from the cross that Jesus died on. And the reformers hate all this. They don't like these statues. They smash them. They say there's so many relics of the true cross, you could build Noah's Ark. There were other places you could go and see breast milk of the Virgin Mary, and you would pay money and the people who owned it would get rich. And Luther and the reformers say, nah, right? They don't merely critique the abuse. They say, look, real religion is not in some physical thing. Real religion is immaterial and interior, not material and interior. This is what we have been taught, that religion is about books, about beliefs, and it is immaterial and on your inside. In addition, Luther survived because there was a prince who wanted freedom from the Catholic Church, and also because he liked something else Luther said. And Luther said, the church is only involved in the care of souls, and you must take care of passing the laws. You take care of the economy and statecraft. That's not our business. And so religion is a separate and distinct realm of life. And eventually we will get the separation of church and state, right? And this is what we've learned. It's books, it's beliefs, it's interior, it's separate. And if it's beliefs and it's interior, you know what else comes with that? It's private. This is the notion of religion as freedom of conscience or belief. It's private, it's interior. And this, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest to you is what I call the Protestant lens. It is a perception of religion that emerged with the Protestant Reformation. It was a Protestant way of seeing religion. And indeed, what has happened over time, is that it has become a Western lens. It doesn't matter if you are Protestant or Catholic or Jew or atheist. If you live in this society, you inherit this lens to greater or lesser extents. In truth, it's even had global impact because the last two great empires were Protestant ones. The British was a Protestant empire that brought it around the world through colonialism. They went to India and they ran the schools. And you know what they told elite Indians' kids in those schools? Don't look at what your mother does. All of those practices, that's kind of Catholic, it's superstition. Your real religion is in these books. Most Hindus were not reading those books. The religion was geared around practice more than religion, but the British tried to teach them something else and also stressed monotheistic understandings of the traditions. And in addition to British colonialism was American cultural power. It wrote the United States wrote a constitution, and they defined religion as freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, and that constitution got copied around the world, and with it came that Protestant lens. And so one of the things I want to suggest to you today in trying to be more inclusive towards other traditions is that one of the things you will have to do is to break or at least temporarily take off the Protestant lens when you're looking at other traditions, because other traditions are oral. First Nations traditions are oral. Even Islam, which is definitely a book of religion, that book is meant to be recited. It is oral. It is poetry. It is to be heard more than read, oral. Many traditions are based around practices. To be a Jew is to practice. In a Catholic church, they will stand up and say the Apostles' Creed. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. I believe in Jesus Christ, His Son. I believe in the Holy Spirit. Protestant churches usually have a statement of beliefs on their website. Hindu temples, they do not. They usually don't have a big statement of beliefs historically. They don't recite their beliefs in that way. It's practices. You go there for what's called arti and darshan, these practices that define you. To be a Jew is to follow the law more than to believe. Many religions are not interior, they're exterior. It's a beard on your face. It's a hijab. It's a kirpan that you carry. It's face paint for some indigenous communities, right? They don't have that notion that it's immaterial. You can wear it on your body. Sometimes it's the very face you see in the mirror. And religions are embedded. They are culture. They are medicine. Hinduism has Ayurvedic medicine. First Nations traditions have medicines that are meant to heal you, heal your soul, but heal your body. They are law. Judaism has law. Islam has law. And they are public and not private. They have no notion sometimes of this idea that it's supposed to be private, kept on the inside. This notion in Canada, the Protestant lens, is so prominent, it has shaped our laws. Back in the late 80s, some of you remember this guy, Baltesh Singh Dhillon, joined the RCMP, and people went ballistic because the RCMP had a dress code and you had to wear a black hat. And he said, I can't, I have a turban, and he had to go to the Supreme Court. Why? Because our very laws interpreted religion as freedom of belief. No one at court argued about what his beliefs were. He believes the wrong thing. Nobody said that. No one said you're reading the wrong book. No one said, what you feel inside your heart and the inside is wrong. No. But as soon as it's on his face, on his head, then people lost their mind, right? And the court had to change the laws, and I would think they were right to do so, but it caused a big uproar. And this is still going on today with Bill 21 in Quebec, which many of you will know of. This bill prevents people with visible religious garments from working for the government. She can't be a teacher. She can't be a cop. She can't be a nurse. She can't be at the office where you get your driver's license, right? Does anyone say she can't believe in Muhammad? No. Does anyone say she can't read the Quran, read that book? No. As long as it's books and beliefs and interior, no problem. But as soon as it's visible, again, people lose their mind. And so when you're thinking about religion inclusion, think about this lens. Sometimes for Indigenous peoples, it's a medicine pouch that carries sacred objects around their neck because religion is not immaterial in First Nations communities. For Hindus, it is murtis that are blessed and divinity is present in the murtis that they have in their houses. And some Muslim men have a beard, sometimes with no mustache, because this is how Muhammad is said to have worn his facial hair. And they want to remember every time they look in the mirror that they want to pattern their lens, pattern their life after the life of the prophet. Okay, so to be aware of our own biases, of racial biases, of monotheism bias, and of the Western lens, as religion is immaterial and private and interior. Secondly, to increase our religious literacy and inclusion. And part of it is what I just did, this Western lens. That is religious literacy, right? Becoming more literate about religions. But there's more to do. We should educate about religions in schools, not proselytize, educate. We need to do it in our workplaces, which I'm really thrilled. This has really opened up in the last 5 years. We need to do it in our communities like you are doing in your church. Religious literacy allows us, as we learn about religions, to get rid of the blank slate, right? As we learn things about religions, then we have knowledge, and knowledge reduces fear. And it allows us then to open a conversation. Hey, you're Muslim, is Eid coming up? How do you guys celebrate that, right? To not see religion as private, to not see it as taboo. And that conversation leads everyone else to feel included at work, at schools, in their neighborhood. Religious literacy is the path to religious inclusion. And we need to increase religious literacy. We need to get away from this idea that you can't talk about religion, because that's just blank slate stuff. That just causes fear. So we need that education. A third way is contact theory. There is much literature that shows that stereotypes and discrimination are reduced the more we engage with others on an equal basis. Contact theory, so if you have, the slaves and slave masters were in contact all the time in the United States, that did not reduce discrimination. It's when they're on an equal basis. In World War II, when blacks and whites had to serve next to one another, the racial stereotypes went down markedly, right? So how do we create this? We create it in our public schools. I remember John Tory ran for premier, and he wanted to fund religious private schools, and I didn't like that idea. I hated how it was fought. It was fought with a lot of Islamophobia about Islamic schools, but I really think public schools are great. Let kids grow up and work with one another in coding computers and in playing volleyball and in doing whatever else. Let them work together as peers. We need this in our workplaces, and we need it in our clubs, our causes, the sports that we join. And one of the big things is the positions of authority. Right? It's one thing to have a multicultural and diverse student body, but what we need is a multicultural and diverse set of teachers and principals and bosses at work. And that's something I'm working with a lot of organizations with, and in our churches. Obviously in churches, you're not going to be promoting Muslims, but promoting people of diverse races as ministers, as boards of churches. Boards are a way to bring this kind of diversity to the positions of authority, because that really shows a kind of equality between people of diverse backgrounds. So contact theory. And fourth, you're coming from a church community, is to draw on religious resources for tolerance and inclusion. I talked about religious Christian resources for discrimination, but there is the reverse, right? There are stories like the Good Samaritan. What's the Good Samaritan? And by the way, I'm just about done. The Good Samaritan is a story where it's not about us. It wasn't the we who helped him. It was the them. The Samaritan was the them guy, but he did the right thing. This is a story about goodness, right? Over tribe. Christian scriptures have sayings like Paul's, where he says in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female, right? There are resources for discrimination, but the resources for the opposite. The KKK used the Bible, so did the people that abolished slavery, right? There is, of course, the golden rule to simply treat others as we would have ourselves treated. And in my opinion, the greatest American of the 20th century, Martin Luther King, right? King was a minister. You listen to King's speech, it is saturated with biblical language, biblical metaphors, biblical theology. So there are religious, if you're in a church, draw on the strengths you have. Watch out for those tools that can be used to harm, but grab on the strengths you have. Okay, so that's what we can do. The last thing I wanted to just leave you with is, if it's possible, I'm happy to help. If I can be of any help with you, religious literacy is sort of what I do. I find it endlessly fascinating. I do have a blog at ReligionsGeek where I write about religions once a week. If you sign up, I also highlight articles in the news or sometimes personal stories that people might find interesting. I do have a series coming up very soon on Thursday nights called Religion, the Big Questions. I invented this series last year. It went great. It's 7 sessions. You can sign up for 1 or 3 or 7. It's all about religion and secularism and politics, how our country deals with how liberal countries deal with religion, and how sometimes they don't know how to deal with them. It's based on my 20 years in the field and on my PhD. And it will definitely increase your religious literacy if you're interested in that. That's at my center site, Encounter World Religions, which is at worldreligions.ca. You can find it at the Religions Geek site too. It'll be there as well. And lastly, there's one last thing I want to mention to you. And I hope I say this right. If I get to hold this event this summer, because of COVID, you never know, it always sells out. And I say that because I really do want to tell you about it, because I think it's cool. Again, I hope this comes out across well. It almost always sells out. So it's not that I need your money. It's that it's the best thing I've ever encountered. My predecessor is the genius who invented it. It's this week, which COVID permitting, I've not been able to run it for the last 2 years, but I ran it 20 years in a row before then. We explore 11 religions in the Greater Toronto area in this one rich week. We have introductory classes to the 11 religions that I teach, and then we go on about 20 site visits. And I can take you to the best spots in Toronto. I know what time to go to catch ritual. I know where the right guides are. It is a week of learning. It is also a week, honestly, of food, of music, of architecture. People describe it as traveling the world. My wife always tells me, Brian, you just need a music tack and show the food and don't worry about anything else, and great guides. We learn about the religions, and then we go out to some of the most fantastic temples. We go to the Sikhs and watch them do this ritual where they put their Granth, that is their holy book, to bed. We meet wonderful people like the Reverend Champagne. Of course, we explore the big religions, and we go to this Greek Orthodox church in downtown Toronto that no one knows about. The entire interior of this building is covered in icons. It is just a gem. And then we go to religions that people don't know much about, like Rastafarian, and we learn about its roots and Black Power, and we talk to Nadi. And we meet Wiccans, and we join a Wiccan coven, and you can join in the ritual or observe. You never have to join in anything you don't want to. And so that's the Discovery Week. And if I don't know if I'm running it yet. I have to see how this COVID thing plays out. But if you're interested in that, keep an eye either at ReligionsGeek or at my center site, worldreligions.ca. Okay, folks, I think I'm right at about the hour marker, slightly over. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and I hope that I don't know if this was exactly what you were looking for tonight. As I say, there were so many directions to go, but I hope that you got something out of it. I hope you come away feeling like you learned something of value. Thank you very much.
Our deep, deep gratitude, Dr. Carwana. That was just wonderful. And if you look at the gallery view, I can see a few hands here clapping and people just sharing their appreciation. So I encourage all of our folks here tonight just to kind of let that appreciation radiate from their hearts and through their screens. And deep, deep gratitude. What a grounding to touch on so much. And I feel like getting, especially through the Canadian lens, a grounding on the ways that just this historical awareness of racism and the ways that religions intersect. And I think this will be a fantastic foundation for our subsequent weeks as we explore, or as we kind of dive in a little more and look at theology specifically, and then look at the experience of, in our final week, 3 panelists, 3 ministers in the United Church. So, boy, it's overwhelming at times. Certainly your awareness of it all and your ability to navigate and thread things through is impressive as well. So just deep gratitude for that.
Thank you.